All right, it's 12 o'clock, so let's begin. I'm going to turn over moderating responsibilities to my colleague, Rachel Lindvall, who's with South Dakota State University Extension.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I want to welcome each and every one of you to our webinar on promoting equity in local food systems through cooperative extension. We are all a little in awe of the fact that over 700 people registered for this event. And on a personal note, let me just say that this is really encouraging that you have all chosen to join us. Today's webinar is presented by our working group on undoing inequality in the food system. This working group is part of E-Extension's community, local, and regional food systems community of practice. That's a mouthful. This webinar is also co-presented by the Sustainable Agriculture Education Association, and we receive generous financial support. It comes from Santa Clara University's Food and Agribusiness Institute. Our goal today is to highlight examples from within Extension of efforts to increase equity and through food system work. We have three speakers whom I'd like to introduce you to now. We have Charlotte Ammons, and Charlotte is with the Equity in Foods. She's the Equity in Food Systems Coordinator, the core team leader for the Center for Environmental Farming Systems with North Carolina State University. Our second speaker will be Heather Manzo, and Heather is the Extension Educator in Agricultural Entrepreneurship and Community Development with Penn State University. And Heather is also a co-founder of the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council. And our third speaker for today is Caitlin Wojak. Caitlin is with Michigan State University Extension, where she is the Community Food Systems Educator. As Lucy mentioned, my name is Rachel Lindvall, and amongst other issues, I work with healthy food access and sovereignty initiatives on the Sicangu or Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota for South Dakota State University Extension. My last introduction, last but definitely not least, is for Lucy Diekman. Lucy is a postdoctoral researcher at Santa Clara University in California. She's in the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences. And my webinar colleagues and I are very grateful to Lucy for both setting up and handling all the technical and logistical aspects of this webinar. And I have a few housekeeping notes before we begin with our speakers. This webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly after the live webinar, probably within 24 hours. Second thing is all of you are automatically muted by the Zoom webinar platform. However, we really do want your participation. So here's how this will work. Today, we'll have each of our three panelists present individually. Following each of their presentations, we'll take a few questions which we feel are really specific to that presentation. Please write your questions into the chat feature located in the Zoom platform, and hopefully all of you can find that chat feature. Please be aware that because there are so many people viewing today, we may not get to all of your questions, but we're going to try. And then after all of our presenters have finished, all three of our presenters, we'll try and take as many of the questions as we can given the time constraints. If you entered a question when you first registered, please don't feel you need to enter it again. We have them here, and again, we'll try to address as many of them as time allows. Finally, if we don't get to your question, please know that we do value it and, of course, your input. All of our presenters have provided their contact information with their presentations, and we'll be happy to get back to you as soon as their scheduled times permit. And now that we have all of that out of the way, we're going to get started with Charlotte Ammons from North Carolina State.
Thank you, Rachel and Lucy. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you for having me. I want to start by, I want to start by, and throughout my presentation, my hope is, and we saw some of the questions y'all posed to the panelists previously, and I just want to kind of give you a heads up that I hope to address as many of your questions as possible throughout my presentations, how I kind of set it up. One question that was pretty prevalent was around challenges in racial equity work. And so one challenge that I want to speak to directly is the challenge of being relevant and the challenge of not being neutral, which is something that is very constant. So I want to applaud everyone who's participating for the commitment that you've already made to this work and to this process. And I also want to call all of us to the specific challenge that's happening in front of us, which is to recognize when all of these systems that oppress people are constantly at play. And we can see that in this current DACA legislation. So I hope that we can find a relevant place for all of our work so that we can align ourselves with people who are most impacted by food systems inequity. And when we think about that, that does include these 800,000 young people who will eventually be impacted by the repeal of DACA. And also, if we think about food systems work in particular and our role at land-grant universities, these 800,000 young people represent those who we serve and are in service of. And another thing to remember, especially in the context and landscape of food systems work, when we think about our food systems contributions, not just in terms of labor and bodies, but also in cultural contributions and our agrarian legacy in this country overall, those young people represent a significant portion. So those 800,000 are easily all of us. So one challenge is to remain relevant and diligent and not neutral in times like this. So all that to say, thank you. Thank you for having me be a part of this conversation at this very critical time. As they mentioned, I'm from the Center for Environmental Farming Systems in North Carolina. I'm a part of a group of folks that constitute the CORE team, and CORE stands for Committee on Racial Equity in Food Systems. CEFS in and of itself has been around for about 20 or so years. And we've formally been doing racial equity work probably for about the last 4 years, since 2014. Okay, so that's three years. So math, we don't do math well, but we do food systems work really well. So around 3 or 4 years. And so we're happy to be able to say that we formalized our work so that we're not just working in communities, but that are most impacted by food systems inequity, but we're working alongside communities and for those communities so that we can then build cohesive and collaborative solutions to address many of these inequities. And that process has gone from, and this is kind of like the shift in our work from where we've actually I would say we've kind of made that explicit commitment. It's gone from being learners to being to elevating to a collective space of consciousness. And so that's where we are kind of in our work. This is kind of a thing that emerged organically in how we've grown to learn together in our racial equity process with the goal of creating long-term systemic change. And this is in no general order, except for the last one, which is repeat. That one always comes last. But so this kind of process organically evolved over the years. And first it starts with conceptualizing, and that means we engage and observe and we seek to ask the who. And a lot of times in our work, at least traditionally, we grew up, or we've in the past used these kind of coded terms, at risk or vulnerable. So we've come to the point of understanding that at risk or vulnerable is the condition. So, but we want to be explicit about who is at risk and who is vulnerable and why. So being very explicit about that is a part of our conceptualization process. Practice just simply means taking a snapshot of how systems are currently operating, and through policy, practice, culture, within our institutions, and then developing practices to be able to interrupt those processes. And so not just interrupt the processes that are not working, but to reinforce the ones that are, and to elevate those into our regular routine policies, practice, procedures, and overall culture. Next step is to build a shared understanding And that's really a recognition that these issues do indeed represent someone's lived experience or reality. So it means peeling back the numbers within the data to really understand a person and a community's narrative and how that narrative contributes to our overall food systems narrative. Next is share. And that is really, it's kind of linked to understanding. That's understanding our power within our institutions to have access to platforms to elevate the stories of marginalized communities, communities that have been most invisibilized and most disparaged in our food systems work historically, so that we don't repeat a lot of the mistakes that of the past within our institutions and within our food system. And then, can y'all hear that rain? It's like pouring in North Carolina right now, in Durham. And then next to last but not least is internalize. And, you know, internalize kind of seems like a passive word, but it's very action oriented. It means examining and shifting our policies, practices, and procedures so that they are more inclusive and that they are more racially equitable. And we have a whole, thanks to some really amazing partners that we have in this work here in North Carolina, we have strategizing worksheets that we use to help us do this, and a lot of very important tools that we have at our disposal. And then we repeat. The significance of this slide, I mean, you can Google CEFS, you know, you can, our website's right there, so you can find out more about what we do on your own time. I don't want to take up a whole lot of time of doing that. You know, so the purpose of this, the main purpose of this slide is not just to, you know, show how baller we are as an organization, because we are quite baller. Just joking, but we are baller. But really, the significance of this slide is to demonstrate the significance of the partnerships that make up CEFS. The partners are three pretty heavy-duty institutions in agriculture and sustainable agriculture and food systems in the state. So we've got the Department of Ag, we've got North Carolina A&T State University, which is the 1890s historically Black land-grant university, and then North Carolina State University that I'm now a part of, that represents the predominantly white institution, 1860s land-grant university. So the significance of this is, one, it demonstrates our capacity to, one, in understanding the vulnerability that, and also the privilege that each of these institutions have. So being able to have a very strong and linked partnership in this way allows us to be able to do more impactful work. And also it helps us understand the legacy of disparity in our food system through our experiences of our own institutions and land-grant universities. So, so for that reason, I would encourage you to really seek out critical partnerships. We've been very fortunate. We're very fortunate in this state to have a partnership like the Center for Environmental Farming Systems. So on the, I guess it would be left of your screen, you'll see the CEFS mission, and on the right of your screen, on this slide, you'll see the purpose of our racial equity work. So, so if you, the left, our mission applies to all people in this state, North Carolina and beyond, and actually, I would go as far as to suggest that this mission would apply to all people in general. This is what we would hope for everyone who participates in our food system. And on the right, if you look at the purpose of our equity work, so it's looking at our mission through a racial equity lens. And so it's our purpose reflects the fact that we know that opportunity to achieve the things in bold in our mission statement is not, is highly racialized, and it's not the same opportunity for everyone. So in order to make a more equitable food system, we don't necessarily think, we're not talking about giving everyone the same thing, because we understand that conditions are different. So so we overlay our purpose over our mission with a racial equity lens. And one analogy that we often use is, okay, for example, say three of you come into a hospital and I'm the ER doctor, right? You come into my ER and you all come in with a headache. So the first person has a headache, first person comes with a headache. The second person comes in with a broken leg. And the third person comes in with a rash on their back side. No, just their back. So I give each of you an aspirin to try to cure what ails you. More than likely, the person that has the headache will go home feeling much better, will be feeling fulfilled, will be healed, if you will. The second person who has a broken leg, probably not so much, and probably similar with the third person with the rash. So when we talk about racial equity, we talk about addressing conditions as they come into our food system. It's not necessarily about giving everyone the same thing, because we understand that people come into our food system and come into our work with different conditions. So we try to address those conditions based on whatever those conditions. We try to build solutions around whatever those conditions might be. I think someone may have posed something similar to this question in the registrations, and I remember I often got asked, why racial equity? What does racial equity have to do with food systems work, and what does racial equity have to do with farming? And I used to kind of struggle with that answer, because I used to come at the answer with a very personal response, and so I started to understand that answering that question based on my own personal experience may not resonate as much with someone who doesn't have a similar personal experience. So that's when I started to understand the importance of having a structural analysis of racism and why race and why food. So now when people start to ask me that question or ask our team that question, we try to respond in a more structural way. Probably with a little bit of shade, because I think it's kind of a no-brainer. But I try to keep the shade to a minimum. But now when people ask me why race, what does race have to do with food, I respond by using policy examples. So I'll say, because of the Naturalization Act of 1790 that omitted indigenous folks, slaves, and women from being full citizens. I say because of the 3/5 clause that treated slaves in this country, Black people, as 3/5 of a white person, in order for more legislative representation and less taxation. I say because of Jim Crow. I say because of the second Morrill Act because the first Morrill Act would not allow Black students to be educated at these land-grant universities in the South. I say because of the Farm Bill. I say because of HB 87. I say because of the Fair Pay Act. I say because of Flint, Michigan. I say because of the Dakota Pipeline. And now I say because of DACA. No matter where you stand on any of these policy issues, these are real life policy issues. So no matter where you stand on these policy issues, it's undisputed that historically and currently that all of these initiatives have had negative impacts on people of color. So that is why, and they all have relevance to food systems and our food systems work. So again, to me, a no-brainer, but it elevates us to a structural conversation as to why race and why food. So what do we mean by racial equity, and what do we mean by using a racial equity lens? I want to credit our friends and our partners at Open Source Leadership Strategies for this definition and for this slide. So racial equity is an equitable society where outcomes are improved for everyone. Race is no longer a determining factor in those outcomes. So when we say that, and also race is no longer a determining factor as to who has access to opportunities, and race is no longer a determining factor as to who is most at risk in our food system. So that means at risk of not having access to fair wage paying jobs, not having access to healthy food, not having access to food that represents them culturally, not having access to good and fair working conditions. So that's what we mean by racial equity. And using that lens, if you can see here, as shared with our friends at Open Source, acknowledge, analyze, strategize, and repeat. It's that simple, y'all. Voila, racial equity in the food system. So this is the process that we've adopted based on this lens at CEFS. And these are our 5 key moving parts right here. So we train, and then we provide a continued and ongoing study group of practice, which we call our in-between study groups. We meet once a month. We grow out and build capacity for our racial equity work by continuing to do all these things. We assess throughout, and we convene. We convene our core team regularly. And can y'all give me a thumbs up or thumbs down on time? I'm thinking I'm probably pretty close, but I want to try to get through these last couple of slides. Oh, and this, I'm just pulling out an example in one of our initiatives. We try to incorporate this racial equity lens through all of our community-based food systems and local foods work here at CIFS. We can't say it's institution-wide, real talk, but we do try to incorporate it through all of our community-based food systems work. And this is an example I just pulled from our Farm to ECE collaborative, which is a statewide collaborative here in North Carolina. So we articulated racial equity goals, not just for ourselves, but for every child care facility that is participating in the initiative. And then we made a goal of at least half of funds going directly back into the communities that we serve. And then we aligned activities to support those different goals using this racial equity lens. And again, we use our tools. We have a strategy worksheet that we use to help kind of walk these goals out. And this is probably at least for me, the worksheet that I continuously go back to in developing our racial equity goals, embedding our racial equity goals and our racial equity work. And so these are thanks to another partner, DR Works. So these are the three expressions of racism that are often present and often kind of dictate our racial equity work and how racism, the ism is expressed in food systems. So our partners at DR Works have provided us with a goals and strategy worksheet, as I mentioned before, that incorporates a power analysis. You know, we often do needs assessments in our community-based work, but we seldom do power analysis to understand how needs can get met. So using a racial equity lens, it also helps us strategically engage stakeholders, power holders in our communities to be able to create, not just create racial equity goals or strategic goals around creating a more racially equitable food system, but also to build capacity for long-term work by knowing which stakeholders to engage at what moments and who who we need to leverage significant relationships in our communities. So, and this is what we've learned along the way. And we know that learning, like the work itself, is a process. We start with the commitment. We try to be as accountable and transparent as possible throughout. We're understanding that this is a marathon and not a sprint, so it is a long-term commitment. Understand the need for both a combination of data and stories to have the greatest impact. And when all else fails, we revert to our toolbox. Our toolbox has been our saving grace. So whenever we get in pickles and binds and we get locked in places where we're not sure of how to translate our work or translate the work into action, we revert back to our toolbox. And in order to have these difficult conversations, gaining a shared understanding and a shared analysis of structural racism and how it affects our food system is very critical. And I think you'll have access, I'm pretty sure you have access to the entire webinar and the slides, but these are just a list of some tools and some resources that have benefited and supported our work along the way. And so I wanted to make sure that we got an opportunity to share those things with you. This is our crew. You know, we don't do this work in isolation. These are our peoples who've been a part of our trainings and continue to support our work along the way. My contact information is there, and so feel free to reach out if you have additional questions or if there are ways we can support each other in our racial equity work. Very happy to do that. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you might have at the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was really impactful. And we do have some questions for you that have come up. One question says, how is the racial equity literacy box explicitly linked to food and farming?
So part of we have a whole kind of list of why racial equity and some characteristics of racial equity framing. And one of those characteristics is to shift the narrative, to have a more inclusive narrative of who is represented in our food system, the cultures represented in our food system. So the food literacy boxes are actual books and stories that are more reflective of a broad representation of who is in and the food culture in our food system. So they consist of a few books, bilingual books, a story stretcher, which is like additional songs and finger plays. And I'm a former children's librarian, so I felt like we felt this literacy component was critical in an effort to make it more inclusive. We made sure we had a tool for preschoolers, not just for the teachers or the parents, but this is specifically for preschoolers to be able to see, one of the most important things as a children's librarian was to make sure that there were tools and resources and literature for all children. Everyone should see themselves represented in a book. So we try to achieve that with some of the stories in the food literacy box. So the purpose of the literacy box is to create a more inclusive narrative of who is represented in the food system and why that's important. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, we have another question. Devin asks, how does CEFS interface with more conventional agricultural systems at large in North Carolina? And where have there been more opportunities for synergies and introducing CEF's racial equity work into the whole of the food system in North Carolina?
Well, geez Louise.
That's a big one.
That's a great question. I'm not going to act like, we have all the answers and that it's been an easy process. I think that the significant thing when trying to integrate the two perspectives around agriculture is to not isolate either. So I grew up in Eastern North Carolina. CEFS, the physical farm, is in Eastern North Carolina. A lot of the folks that work on the farm are from Eastern North Carolina. So there's a shared experience around rural culture and Southern culture that brings people together. And so I think you find that starting place of inclusivity, and then you create the narrative around, because I think what we often get confused when we talk about racial equity is that we think it's exclusive to making things better for people of color or addressing systemic issues for people of color. But a truly racially equitable society benefits everyone. So anyone who comes into this conversation knows that it's kind of like a seesaw effect. So if there are people who are oppressed by racialized disparity, then there are people who benefit. So it's really understanding how we can do both, how sometimes we benefit, and then how our benefits often oppress those who are most marginalized. So it takes a while, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, so it starts with a commitment, but there is that bridge around the integration of race and place that I think is a significant way to bring people to the table for a more inclusive conversation.
Great. Okay. Let's see. An anonymous questioner says, what situations exactly prevent people of color from purchasing land or being a part of our food system, such as growing food or selling at the same prices as other farmers? It's a big one.
Racism. Structural racism. No, I mean, I'm not sure the question. I think the impact is different for different communities, and I think isolating the impact just to put it in this current moment and this current landscape doesn't give us the full picture. So I think maybe there's a lot of historical reasons why all of these things are likely more difficult for people of color, especially in Southern communities, which is my landscape and my experience. And they often have to do with historical policies, practices, and procedures. So I would encourage you to look at historical policies, actually probably even current policies, because I'm thinking about even look at DACA right now, and how that marginalizes people. People are now afraid to come out of the shadows and participate in any of our public systems. So there's this so racism marginalizes people. It puts people, the purpose is to isolate and put people on the fringe and institute fear in this whole hierarchy of who is allowed to have privilege, who is allowed to have their full dignity and their full humanity. So I think that's really at the root of the answer to your question.
Okay. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to move over to our next presenter. And remember, there will be some more time, hopefully, at the conclusion of all the presentations. And our next presenter is Heather Manzo from Penn State University. Thanks.
Okay, hi everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. And thank you for the introduction, Rachel, and for your presentation, Charlotte. It's a pleasure to participate with everybody today. And I am sharing screen. So again, I am Heather Manzo, and I'm having trouble going into the presentation mode. So give me just a second. It is not wanting to advance slides here. So this isn't full screen, but I'm wondering if this will suffice. Okay, so again, I'm Heather Manzo with Penn State Extension, and I'm also one of the founders of the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council, which has been convening since 2009 in this iteration. I've been lucky enough to be working in this extension role for almost a decade, focusing on how agriculture can impact local economies and the bigger food system to create a more robust and resilient economy overall. The demographics in my region are really diverse. We've got urban, rural, peri-urban, and there's a lot of racial, economic, and educational diversity amongst the population, and that's within the greater Pittsburgh food shed alone. And so it's been a real challenge to figure out where the power brokers are, as Charlotte was mentioning, as well as the real community needs that are so disparate, and how to weave those pieces together. And so throughout this presentation, I wanted to point out a couple of things. The work of the council is separate but complementary to the extension work. I really wanted to point out that the Food Policy Council here in Pittsburgh is a reflection upon dozens and dozens and dozens of wonderful colleagues who've worked together over the last almost decade to create systems level change. And so these are individuals that have worked in professional and non-professional roles, and in public and private organizations, and just individual citizens as well. And also, you'll notice on my presentation as well that there are quotes in the bottom right hand from food system change agents and leaders of color from around the country. And I really wanted to talk about this very local and place-based example of food systems work, but I wanted to provide these quotes to elevate the different voices from around the country that really are representing a larger movement that's happening. So a lot of the questions we talked about, or that we had coming with the registrations, and thanks everybody for those, was really looking at tools that could be used to help do assessments. And so this slide has been really helpful to assessing in an ongoing way both my extension programming and whenever I was chair and co-chair of Food Policy Council for several years during the developmental phase, really trying to get a broad scope of individuals who are represented at the table and institutions. And that's an effort to find a roadmap forward of both needs, and also to identify those with resources or hands-on levers of power that could be leveraged to meet those needs on the ground. And so in general, Western Pennsylvania has had several decades of international building intentional building of its regional food economy, we have a lot of small and mid-scale family farms doing a lot of diversified vegetable, animal, fruit production that sell direct and also through small-scale wholesale. So my initial extension program really worked to look at how individual businesses and entrepreneurs could work together to create this resilient local food system. And in a very short amount of time, it became apparent to me that those clients, as I called them, could only go so far as their credit, their capital, their risk tolerance, and the community readiness to support that entrepreneurship. And so again, using this assessment tool did help in a strategic way to assess the engaged partners, sectors, and to identify who was missing. And so you can see in this, you've got a number of roles that people could play, types of organizations. And I think that this is a great model, even though community-based food system models have evolved since this Michigan State piece came out. But again, a systems tool that makes sense to individuals working together is really critical. And one thing we kept finding in this scan is that folks at the table wanting to get at systemic change were self-identifying as white. And it became clear very early on, both in my extension work and through the council development work, that effort was really needed to be done to focus on engaging leaders and citizens and communities of color. And so, you know, that strategic engagement and strategic scan is not necessarily a slam dunk, but I just did want to share to illustrate, you know, the types of tools that can be used to help this kind of work around the country, and that they really can come out of community planning groups, nonprofits, as well as the academic sector. But the underlying point of whatever tool is adopted is to allow the voices of community members to be heard. So the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council developed slowly over time. It took us a long time to go from programmers to policy folks, and there was a collective learning curve that did take several years to refine each organization and individual contributing to the whole, to really carve out a niche and then to work together to look at what policy levers and conversations could be had to get at some of that systemic change. This is a very crowded marketplace. There are several sectors using agriculture as everything from a business opportunity to a land use or development project. There's a lot of grant dollars fueling this work. And again, there's just a lot of socioeconomic disparity. And for a while in some sectors, there were some pretty specific outdated food and ag-related policy that were getting in the way of communities, for example, doing gardening or urban ag projects that could increase the food sovereignty and the food access issues that we have here. The Food Policy Council was created almost in tandem with the development of this new extension program, although its mission and activities are wholly separate and distinct. The coordination of interested entities was needed to bring together the different community members and organizations with power brokers to positively impact this systemic change and elevate voices experiencing and working on issues related to inequalities in the food system. So at the same time that all of this was percolating, with the council, Extension here in Pennsylvania was doing an experiment in creating urban centers. So here in Pennsylvania, Penn State has 2 urban centers, one in Pittsburgh and one in Philadelphia. And these 2 centers often pilot traditional extension curriculum that has been adapted for diverse populations. So it's been really interesting decade of work, you know, looking at how can there be significant, very place-based work at the same time with working through the vehicle of the land grant and extension to see how we can play around with that programming across the state and with diverse communities. And so the council development continued to succeed and thrive and grow. Of course, it all wasn't a straight line of success, and there's still a lot of work to do ahead. But this took assistance from colleagues representing, again, multiple organizations, the university, as well as other local universities. And this was all developed together to create a collective table to learn about individual, organizational, and community needs and bring together, again, those power brokers. So much like Cholette's presentation, it's just critical to continuously be doing that type of scan to make sure that both needs and resources and those with the ability to change small things are brought together to create that common understanding to get at changes. So that leads directly into the power of the collaborative and the power of the collective. And so the original goals of the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council focused on doing change around urban ag zoning policy and land use policy, and ensuring that agriculture was valued for multidimensional purposes. We wanted to look at how increasing access of fresh, healthy, affordable food could happen to residents, and that land could be protected and held to do so. We have many food deserts, and as one colleague said, food swamps in Pittsburgh. Food swamps are something that don't fit into the USDA definition of food deserts, but in a place with very hilly and, you know, we've got lots of rivers and streams and challenging topography and a poor public transportation system, it really makes it difficult for many, many, many individuals in this city to have access to food and to get to the store. So currently, the membership includes over 80 organizations and over 130 individuals. We have a structure that includes 5 paid staff, which are generously supported from the Pittsburgh philanthropic community. We're really blessed in this region to have a lot of family foundations that are interested in food systems work and sustainability issues. The council has 3 working groups and then executive committees, including steering committee, governance, fundraising, and finance. And so this grew, in 8 years from a group of a few folks employed in, agriculture and community development sectors into this really robust group that has tentacles that reaches into a lot of different sectors and really brings a lot of intentional thought and diverse professional skill sets to the table to be able to create that systemic change. So the university and other support I wanted to touch on. Several questions that were submitted did kind of focus on organizational resistance to doing work in this space. And so I just wanted to mention, Penn State was really instrumental in both supporting me as we went through these growing pains and the initial starts and fits at creating a council. By incubating the Food Policy Council, although again, it acts independently, and the university supports the council since the beginning through now by dedicating staff time, funding, and in-kind resources to the operation of the council. During the establishment period, it was critical to keep, for me as an extension employee, to keep the rules of extension in mind regarding no advocacy and government relation policies when I had my extension hat on. And so again, this was a bifurcation of work where it provided a home and a venue for the research-based neutral best practice information that extension has to have a vehicle into multiple organizations and multiple communities to be able to have what's hopefully a further reach than if we did not have the council. So this is a shot of our current steering committee. In going through the assessment scans and still continuing to recognize that while diversity was increasing in the council, there still is a lot of self-identified, white individuals participating as staff paid professional positions. There was a great outreach effort to engage all types of different individuals and organizations that have a stake at food and health and a higher quality of life for residents here in the area. And so the spring meeting had a very nice introduction to our new expanded steering committee. So in addition to a broader variety of faces and professional skill sets, the steering committee also represents diversity in terms of sector that has leadership position now in the council. Briefly, some of those include the regional food economy. We have a couple of spots on our steering committee for community representatives. We have research, food access and recovery, labor, environmental sustainability, agricultural production, economic development, youth service, and health and nutrition. And so these faces really represent a lot of organizations and staff behind each of these organizations and people embedded in communities that are coming from very different backgrounds, from the public health sector to food system supply chain work, all the way through community youth engagement and tons of other skill sets. So extension resources and diversity. So I wanted to pause and talk again about the other side of this relationship, the two sides of the same coin with extension and the Pittsburgh Food Policy Council and the work that happens here in the region, and talk about how extension fits into the equation. So land grants are really unique and have amazing and rich resources. And I wanted to point that out just for those of you who are part of extension and a land grant, or for those of you who are not and come from any variety of backgrounds to this. So extensions do exist to partner with communities, individuals, and organizations, and that's to provide research-based best practice. You can think of us as your public consultants in some ways. And so we have over 100 years of history of working in agriculture, in the agricultural space. And so this is an example, this photograph is an example of last week. Our Black Urban Gardener group in Pittsburgh is launching a farm on a new site. And this is my colleague from Northeast Sayre doing a soil sample during a site visit as the group prepares to put up high tunnels and to build out their beds. And so there is that very, policy-oriented work, but then there also is the nitty-gritty that goes into agricultural production. And we really are here and dedicated to help work in all of those different areas. Other things to realize about extension is that a lot of folks come at this work in the urban environment with social impact missions and not just production agriculture. So for those of you who are with extension, it's important to realize too that this is about a lot more and is very different from just straight production agriculture goals. So our agriculture is happening everywhere, and that's one of the really, really exciting pieces of this work is that we've got rural and urban places, all kinds of groups, school children to immigrants and refugees that we work with. There's land reuse projects, so we get involved with development authorities, the mayor, housing authority, and and it's just happening absolutely everywhere that plants can grow. And so this is a really exciting place to deploy those extension resources. And again, connect groups to resources such as federal funding, NRCS, and research and things like that. So some brief collective accomplishments. The council has worked again with city council and the mayor's office to have an urban ag policy passed. First, initially in 11 and then 15, there was an amendment to make it more affordable and to be have agricultural activities happen by permit, by right rather than exception, allow for small animal husbandry, beekeeping, things like that. Another exciting piece is that was used in partnership with Allegheny County Conservation District and Penn Institute of Policy to create an urban ag model ordinance that is going to be deployed as a toolkit around the state of Pennsylvania this fall. So it's exciting to move from that local and then to the state examples of the work and how it can grow and spread. There was also a couple of years ago a seed law. The PAC law was reinterpreted thanks to efforts of members of the council to ensure that things like seed libraries could exist to have access to seeds, just like checking out a book at local libraries. Also, the council has Food Day annually, which elevates annual issue themes and engages a broader group of stakeholders. Also working with Harvard Food Policy Law Clinic in order to look at how food can change in schools. And also recently, several council members have been appointed to the state Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's new Urban Ag Committee. So institutionalizing change really can be slow. So patience and baby steps are critical. Looking at internal marketing. So for those of you who are approaching sort of a wall with wanting to do change, align the mission of your home organization with allies and needs, and that should give a roadmap forward to create win-wins with everybody. Use benchmarking, learn what other peer organizations are doing, share successes, and come with a solution-based plan that makes sense to leadership and identify community needs. So again, create those win-win those win-win situations. Great resources for food policy creation include Johns Hopkins Center for Livable Futures, runs a great food policy network where a lot of information and research and how-tos are archived. Harvard Food Policy Law Clinic, again, can offer some technical assistance at times. And again, it's really important, no matter what you're working on, to make room for people on boards, invite diverse individuals, and encourage real and genuine participation. And always find funding. That never helps or never hurts, always helps. So what's next?
Thank you, Heather. You know, we hate to interrupt, but for some reason we're really running late. If you can give us just a quick conclusion, we'd love it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And I was just about to do that. So thank you for moderating, okay. Rachel. So I just want to say what's next. Land access and tenure is huge. It is just so important, you know, to think about the fact that land is power and always has been in this country. And the council is also, last thing I wanted to say, is creating a task force and a set of strategies this next year, which acknowledges the continued work ahead of us to help find our role in undoing structural racism in the food system and continue to allow real engagement with the diversity of voices. So thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, I think that what we'll do, just so we have time, is we'll proceed with having Caitlin Wojak from Michigan State University give her presentation, and then if you can hold your questions, we'll see if we can put aside a few minutes for them at the end. So if you want to proceed, Caitlin, we're eager to hear what you have to say. Thanks again, Heather.
Thanks for the introduction, Rachel, and thank you, Heather and Charlotte, for both of your wisdom and experiences that you shared. And for the audience, I'm just going to apologize. I'm not really able to share my screen, so you won't be able to see me. I had some internet connectivity issues, so hopefully my lovely voice will be good enough. So I don't want to lose the connection by sharing my video. So I'm going to share a little bit of a different level of effort from Michigan State University Extension. We're here at Extension in Michigan, where our anti-racism and equity work is really pretty young, and it's definitely in its infancy stages compared with what you heard from Heather and Charlotte. So I think that there's some utility in hearing from a younger initiative in case you're just getting started with this work, and the webinar team felt like, you know, it might be nice to have kind of a range of experiences represented across this presentation, and ours is really in development, so you'll get to see some of the kind of the murkiness of how that looks, I suppose. And I just want to acknowledge that I'm sure there's a lot of people that are tuned in right now that are, you know, at this stage or beyond. And Lucy, maybe I'll just say next when to hit the animation. So I'm on the second point, if you could go there. Okay, thank you. And then just, you know, a bit of background about what we're up to and things that I want to acknowledge to frame what I'll say. So within Extension in Michigan, the Community Food Systems team has had an interest in pursuing anti-racism and equity work, and that's the team that I'm a part of. And I think it's important to share that we're an entirely white identifying team and that we work with and within communities of color. So that's part of our motivation and our commitment to equity. But we've really kind of struggled with how to be explicit about the commitment in a formal way and in a way that works across the entire team, because the state of Michigan is huge and looks really different in different parts. So next point. And also important to acknowledge that we have a really strong connection, our team does, with the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems based on MSU's campus, and that we share this interest and commitment to equity work with them. And the center has really incorporated equity learning and action requirements into their staff plans of work, which our team is drawn on as an example of how to formally incorporate equity into our work, but we're still kind of figuring out what that looks like for Extension staff. And then lastly, so all these factors and then more, obviously, have informed our approach to embarking on the journey of anti-racism and equity. And as a team, we've decided to start with more of an internal staff development approach around anti-racism efforts. And we want to get to the place where our equity work is built into all of our initiatives, and we have really healthy, accountable relationships with people of color-led organizations and are working towards shared goals. And we feel that we need to do some work to get our internal house in order first. And that's especially being mindful of, you know, coming from a large institution that has a pretty mixed record of prioritizing equity and trying to honor that. So on the second slide, if you would, what has happened so far is that we've focused on this staff development approach, and together the Community Food Systems team and the Center for Regional Food Systems work to bring a training from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond to MSU last fall, and it was a specific anti-racism and equity training. And the planning team for that workshop really wanted an external training for our staff to develop sort of a shared language and an understanding of racism in order to be better equipped to move forward in our anti-racism work. And some of the things to highlight about that experience. So the first one, Lucy, thank you, the goal was to get pretty broad MSU Extension involvement with a food systems focus. So most of the participants in that workshop were from the Community Food Systems team and the Center for Regional Food Systems. And then there were a smaller number of staff from other institutes within Extension, other MSU entities from campus, and then we did have community members that participated as well. And it was really recommended to us that we aim for a racially representative group of participants from the organization, which we got to, but I don't know how much that's saying because MSU Extension and MSU in general really is very overwhelmingly white. So I'll acknowledge that while saying that we were probably representative of our entire staff. And then another point is that we had to bring in funding for this training, and I know folks on the questions beforehand asked about funding, and we had to raise about $10,000 for a training like this. So that was an abbreviated training also, and it was really pieced together by the Center for Regional Food Systems, the Community Food Systems work team, the institute that our team is housed in, and then 2 supportive endowed chairs on campus. And I'll talk a little bit about struggles with that in a second. But the next point is that I think the workshop was really possible because we had buy-in both from my direct supervisor, which was built over a long period of time, and then and through funding. My supervisor was able to help fund that. And then our director was new at the time of this training and was supportive, although didn't fund. So it's helpful to have that support, yet the financial piece isn't quite there yet. And some of the challenges that we faced were, again, getting enough funding, really asking a lot of people to contribute to this and acknowledging that it wasn't necessarily a organizationally wide supported thing. So we had to go to the people that would be supportive and realized that we needed more funding at a certain point and had to go back to those people again. And some were willing to contribute more and others weren't really willing to do that. So that was a challenge, but we did figure it out eventually. And we also struggled to get buy-in from all of the Extension Institute directors. So we didn't have representation from everyone across Extension. We had 3 of 4 institutes represented. And then lastly, I just want to say that the planning team for this workshop wanted to be really clear about the fact that this wasn't a one-time event. It was meant to be more of a jumping off point for future conversations and opportunities to advance anti-racism and equity work within our organization. And I'm just really going to briefly talk about one of those things that has spun off from that that original training, just to give you an idea of a different opportunity, I suppose. So at Extension in Michigan, we have, we're really blessed to have a person who fills the role of our diversity and personnel specialist. And for those folks on the national level who are engaged with diversity and inclusion work, you might know Leonardo Pisagna. He's a truly amazing person and has really helped to push this work forward in our organization. And he was on that planning team for the People's Institute training. And he's worked with a smaller group of us to shape this opportunity to continue the conversation and the learning that occurred at the People's Institute training. So he's really led this initiative and then has graciously offered a learning opportunity to myself and another colleague to co-facilitate and learn more about guiding these conversations. So just a few pieces of information about what this opportunity has looked like. We called it Power, Privilege, and Racial Equity. And it was set up as a commitment for a group of about 20 people, most of whom attended that original training. And again, they're mostly food systems folks, but we have some other representation from Extension and other MSU entities and one community member. And we've met quarterly, so it's an ongoing conversation, and it's about 3 hours long every time we meet. And we've covered the topics that you see on your screen now. And we've gotten through the first 3 sessions, and then our last session will be about racial equity. But this space has really given us a framework to think about these issues and how they apply to our work and lives. And then also, you know, allowed us to think about how issues of power, privilege, and equity through a racial lens relates to our work and like grapple with how those issues play out in our day-to-day, and then how we can work against these systems rather than perpetuate them. And I've found it to be super valuable. So in closing, I'm trying to be quick here, given our time considerations. This is just really a beginning step for us, and wanted to share it as you know, kind of a baby step for folks that might be newer to the journey. And I'll turn it back to Rachel with that.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. That was great. You know, we have some general questions out there. What I would encourage you to do, we are just about out of time, and unless I hear otherwise from Lucy, I think we need to be respectful of that. I don't know how much longer we can stay. What I would encourage you to do is, there have been some great discussions going on in both the question and answer box and in the chat section. So lots of things going on in there that are definitely worth reading. And you know, there's so much power in this topic and what we're talking about that I know that we're giving it a little bit of short shrift, but that brings us to thinking about what we want to do going forward. I think, unless I'm told otherwise by Lucy, who's our timekeeper and doing all those things, we'll bring up a few of the questions that we have seen. And so one person asked, are people resisting the conversations around food access and equity? Do marginalized people feel their efforts are interrupted or lacking the skills and resources and opportunities to improve their own status? And it's a great question, and I'm not sure if any of our panelists want to take a quick stab at that in their experience.
Generally, the answer is yes.
Yeah. Okay. I think that in general, if those of you asking questions like that, if you're sensing that, it's often there's a reason that you are. We had some questions before that talked about resistance from institutions that we work with. One great question that I liked is, how can we apply equity and anti-racism principles to our work when our university is in denial? And I wonder if any of you want to speak to that one. Have you been in supportive environments or places where perhaps you had to do a little bit of tilling some groundwork there?
This is Heather, and I can offer a brief example that, you know, when you work for an organization that has public dollars and has no advocacy rules embedded in it, that if those are broken could jeopardize the whole federal state funding, yes, there's resistance. And so I think that, you know, again, looking at what is the core mission of the organization. And for those of us who are programmers, needs assessments of individuals in our communities are the traditional method of looking at how to deliver programming. So matching organizational goals with community needs, with funding opportunities, and finding that sweet spot while giving success-based examples of other peer institutions really has gone a long way here in Pennsylvania to build consensus internally and externally.
Okay, well, thank you. I think that's a challenge that a lot of us think about. So I think we are just about out of time, and I know that there are lots of unanswered questions, and reality, that's not surprising. And also, really, that's a very good thing that we have sparked lots of questions and ideas in your minds. I'm going to end by saying that the leaders of our work group within our e-extension community of practice are working with the MSU, Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems, to obtain some funding to further build the capacity of the work group so that we can offer more webinars and other resources for this important intersectional area of food systems and racial equity. If there are webinar topics you'd like us to cover in the future, please reach out and let us know. And we hope that you will join us for future webinars. And we certainly appreciate your all coming. And again, this was it was live streamed on YouTube, and you can catch it there if you'd like to, see that recording. And you'll also be able to see the recording off of the Zoom platform as well. So again, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, we thank you all very much for coming and hope to run into you again and hear you. And we have enjoyed your questions and your presence. Thanks again for joining us.